Alright, welcome back. I'm pretty excited to talk about this topic today. Top CI/CD tool for 2023. Now, if you've just got started with DevOps or you are already an established DevOps engineer, CI/CD is one of those topics you just can't run away from. Whether you are just a fresher into a project or you've been working on DevOps from past many years, CI/CD is one such tool or fundamentals for that matter in DevOps wherein you got to get started with, whether it's application or infrastructure. You got to have adequate knowledge about CI/CD tools so that you can suggest a new tool or you can start using the tool. In this session, I'm going to talk about the top CI/CD tool which I have curated for you based on my experience of using many CI/CD tools over the last few years. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so we've got the agenda. Now, in terms of agenda, what we're going to do is we are going to get started with the we're going to talk about 4 different tools, not many tools. These are pioneer in CI/CD world. Now, these tools are heavily used by companies, Fortune 500 companies or startups to configure the CI/CD for their application or infrastructure. I'm going to use both the terms application and infrastructure because nowadays CI/CD is also considered for infrastructure. Now, when I say infrastructure, it's the cloud provider, it's the Terraform script, it's the Ansible script, it's the Pulumi script, it could be a PowerShell script as well. Alright, so these are infrastructure. Or application is your .NET application, Java application, Node.js, Python, could be anything. But the fundamental remains same. So in terms of agenda, we're going to get started with our first tool, which is GitLab right over here. So we're going to talk about what GitLab is, how it is structured, and how you could use GitLab for your CI/CD. Then we're going to talk about GitHub. Then we're going to get started with Azure DevOps Pipeline, which is Microsoft product for creating DevOps life cycle. And then you've got CircleCI as well, a very beautiful product again. At the end, it's up to you which tool you want to use. My job is to make you aware about these tools, what are the pros and cons, and how you can kind of compare these tools with each other. Alright, so before getting started into these tools, I want to take a few minutes of yours to talk about what continuous integration is, and that's the same analogy we're going to take further and understand the concept of all of these tools. So as a developer or an infrastructure engineer or a DevOps engineer, whatever you want to call, you push your code to a source code. Now, the source code could be anything, could be Bitbucket, could be GitHub, could be GitLab, could be Azure DevOps, could be any form of code. As soon as somebody pushes the code, now comes the CI/CD platform, which takes the code, compile it, build it, and then deploy into probably a Kubernetes cluster, probably an EC2 Linux machine, or a Windows machine, could be anything. And then it gives how the CI/CD looks like, whether it has failed or whether it has passed, how long did it took. So this is about CI/CD. I wanted to make sure that you have the concept clear before we get started. Alright, let's move on to our first topic, which is infrastructure deployment. Now, the CI/CD process for infrastructure typically includes the following steps in front of you. Alright, so this is the workflow which we generally maintain. Doesn't matter which environment you are, which client you're working for, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, whether it's a telecom company, whether it's a mobile company or an automobile company, doesn't matter. These are 4 different steps which you got to follow for your CI/CD life cycle. The first one is you start with the code commit right over here. As a developer or infrastructure engineer, you commit the code, you write the code, right? And then you push the code using git push, git commit, git add in a chronological way. Second is the continuous integration. Now, automate as soon as you push the code, the CI engine, which could be your GitLab, Bitbucket, GitHub, Azure DevOps, could be anything, or CircleCI, which we're going to talk about as well, takes up the code, check out the code, alright, and then builds the code, compile the code, and create an artifact. Artifact could be in the form of a pip package, could be a Maven package, could be anything. Then you've got continuous deployment. Now continuous deployment and delivery has a difference. One of them is a more of an automated way, don't need any manual button to click, so which is continuous deployment, and it requires a high level of confidence in the automation process, because you're saying that I am confident about deploying my code onto production without any manual introspection. Where in delivery, once the code has been validated in the staging environment, it can be automatically deployed to production. There's difference between deployment and delivery, just a click of a button, wherein in one of the process you don't need any manual process of clicking a button. As soon as the code is pushed, built, tested, gets deployed without any manual introspection. Alright, that brings us to the first topic. Now all of these 4 steps can be achieved using all the tools which we're going to talk about in this today's session. The first one is GitHub Action. Now one of my personal favorite, I've been using it past many years now. I've used it for an automobile company, I've used it for a pharmaceutical company as well, so I'm loving this product. So GitHub CI/CD is called as GitHub Action, is a CI/CD and general automation system introduced by GitHub in 2018, and nearly that's when Microsoft also bought GitHub Action. So it's not a very old tool, but it's a very easy to use tool. Few of the fundamentals, or few of the advantages which we get with GitHub Action is, the first one is you don't need to sign up for a separate CI/CD. So if you're a developer, high chances you are already using GitHub to push your code. Now it's just an integration. CI/CD of GitHub or GitHub Action is just an extension of that. You don't need to log in or sign up to a new tool. If you're using GitHub, you could get started with GitHub Action, which is the CI/CD. You don't have for other tools like TravisCI, HarnessCI, or CircleCI, DroneCI. You don't have to log into a separate tool. So one tool for also keeping the code and running the CI/CD as well. You don't need to install and manage your CI/CD services. Example like Jenkins, Bamboo, or TeamCity. You don't need to set up webhooks and access token for connecting your CI/CD, because GitHub Action is already in GitHub, because it's both are same tools. That's why my recommendation, if you're already using GitHub, go ahead and use GitHub Action for CI/CD purpose as well. So that was about GitHub Action definition. Now let's take a look at how the workflow looks like, how GitHub Action in a nutshell looks like. So this is the high level overview of how a pipeline in GitHub would look like. You get started with the repository first. So you create in your repository, you create a .github folder, you get a workflow folder underneath that, and then you can start different workflows. Now pipelines in GitHub is called as workflows. You could have one workflow file for infrastructure, you could have another workflow file for application, another workflow file for some other operation. All of these are pipelines and they sit under workflows. You could give it a different name as well, like I do, but the .github and workflows folder name has to be maintained as it is. Then underneath each workflow you could have different jobs running on these runs in a runner. Now runner is common across any CI/CD tool. In GitHub it is called as runner, and it is maintained under a job. Underneath each job you could have multiple steps. Now these steps could be pulling up the code, running a shell command, copying a file from one location to another, and whatnot. And then each job could have multiple steps as well. So this is a very high level overview of how the GitHub Action looks like. Now talking about a sample repository, I've got a sample workflow file for you. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paste in my GitHub workflow as well. I've created a sample Python project, I've created a sample Kotlin project as well, so I'm gonna put in the link so you can go ahead and take a look at the GitHub Action workflow file as well. So this is how the workflow looks like. You've got the name of the workflow, then you've got the jobs. Underneath jobs you've got multiple steps. Now these steps could be anything, could be copying a file, could be curling a website, could be anything, could be cleaning the source. Now this is a sample workflow, so we're not going to get into the nitty-gritties. I would like to talk a little more about different components or fundamentals of GitHub Actions. Now the first one is workflow, which I just mentioned. The workflow is the high level topmost concepts into GitHub Action, wherein you create these different workflows for different application. Then underneath each workflow you could create multiple workflows under .github workflow folder. A workflow is triggered by one or more events. Like, in order to trigger that pipeline or workflow, you need to have some sort of events. When do you want to trigger it? When you push a code, when you raise a PR, when somebody merges the code, when do you want to trigger this workflow? This is given by events. You tell when do you want to trigger this workflow, on a PR or on a commit, when. Then you've got job, which a workflow can consist of multiple jobs, and job contains a set of commands that will be run when the workflow is triggered. Got runners. Now this is where all the GitHub Action job runs. You got to need a machine. You got to have a machine or a Kubernetes cluster to run all of these steps which we have defined in the workflow, right? This is the runner. It could be Linux, Mac OS, could be Windows, could be any flavor. Steps. A job consists of a sequence of steps, as mentioned over here. A step is either a shell command, could be a PowerShell command, could be anything. It's going to differ basis on your environment, on your application. Then you've got your actions. Now action is a reusable component. That's where the whole fundamental of GitHub Action is. These are plugins already developed by GitHub developers, could be developed by you and me also. You develop those plugins, you publish into the marketplace of GitHub, and anybody can use it without paying a single penny. Now these actions could be anything, could be login to Azure, could be login to AWS, could be creating a AKS cluster, could be copying a file, so you don't have to write anything steps or custom. You could simply use these actions and start using it for your project. So this is basically a module or a function which is already written by people, and we can start leveraging it. That's about it from GitHub Action. I hope this was informative. Now I'm going to move on to our next tool, which is GitLab CI/CD. Alright, so again, GitLab CI/CD built on top of Git pretty quickly has gained a lot of attraction, but fundamentally I feel these two tools are pretty similar. GitLab CI is a little more bit intuitive, so it's a little more fancier than GitHub Action. GitHub Action is pretty simple to use, wherein GitLab has given a little more of color combination. That's the only difference. The YAML looks pretty much same. You'll see in the demo as well. Alright, so GitHub as a complete GitLab, for that matter, as a complete DevOps lifecycle application, provide its user like us with an integrated CI/CD features, which is managed through a single file placed at the repository's root. Now this is you don't need a folder, unlike GitHub Action. What you need to put the file, the YAML file, into the repository root. Wherever your repository is, just put that file underneath that. In a nutshell, the user will put the CI/CD configuration in a file name, so that's the file name you got to maintain in GitLab. Remember, in GitHub you had .github/workflows/workflow.yaml. Over here you've got no folder, but .gitlab-ci. This is how it recognizes, okay, whatever is written under GitLab CI, you got to run, GitLab got to run those steps. So GitLab will run the configured CI/CD script, whatever you have mentioned in your GitLab-ci YAML. Alright, that was about the definition. Now let's take a look at a very high level overview of how GitLab CI/CD works in general. So I've got your code over here. Somebody creates a branch, or it doesn't matter, you don't need to create a branch if you're following a trunk based approach. Push the code, and now the CI cycle in GitLab triggers. If you have a test, unit test, smoke test, whatever you want to run, integration test, it runs it. If you have a failure, notify it. push the code fixes after the failure, run the automated test again. When everything passes, it goes for the PR reviews or review to somebody to review it, and press a manual button to merge the repo back, merge the branch back, and deploy onto the environment. Now this environment again could be anything, could be EC2 instance, Kubernetes cluster, web app, Lambda function, could be anything. So in a nutshell, pick up any CI/CD tool in the world, the process is gonna remain same. The vendors or these creators just change few colors here and there, change bunch of features, few features, but overall the fundamentals, how this code would be pushed, how it will be built in the CircleCI cycle, and then how it would be deployed remains same. Alright, how the pipeline looks like in GitLab is pretty similar. Alright, so you've got your stages and you define all the stages, and underneath it you define what are the stages you want. You want the test, define the test to run, and then in the test you define what do you want to run inside the test. Do you want to run what are the commands you have? Is a bash command or a PowerShell command, could be anything. Then you define what would be the workflow under the pre-build stage, then what would be under the build stage, then what would be under the deploy stage. So once you've defined these, and you could straight away upload into the root of your repository. Alright, that's it from the pipeline. Now let's take a look at the fundamentals of GitLab. In a nutshell, it's same. You've got your runner first. Now runner is again the same in GitHub as well, right? It scripts configured for GitLab CI/CD will be executed by this runner. Again, this runner could be anything, could be a Windows machine, could be a Linux machine, could be a Mac OS as well if you're working on an iOS app. Now is an open source project with various features on how to run CI/CD. Second one is the pipeline. Now it is, if you compare with GitHub, it's the workflow. The name changes, it's still the YAML. Pipeline is the top level component of continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. A pipeline will be created when a new push is made to the GitHub repository, rather GitLab repository. Keep mixing them both, but pretty similar in nature. You've got your runner over here, you've got your runner in GitHub as well, you've got your workflow in GitHub, you've got your pipeline over here, you've got your jobs over here, you've got your jobs in GitHub as well. So job is something that defines what will be run. Below is an example of GitHub action. I'm gonna show you the example later, but that's the name which you got to maintain in the repo. So .gitlab.-ci-yaml is the file name which you got to maintain. You've got your stages then, and underneath the stages is the categorization of your jobs. It defines when and how the job will be run. By default, a pipeline will have 3 stages: build, test, and deploy when you create it. Alright, that's pretty much all in terms of GitLab. I hope you've got a gist of how GitLab is compared with GitHub. That brings me to our next tool, which is Azure DevOps. Let's dive straight into it. So Azure DevOps is, again, I've used this tool as well. It's a Microsoft proprietorship tool, which means it's a paid tool. Microsoft doesn't give you any tool at free of cost. Nowadays it has started Visual Studio Code and a lot of other tools, but generally most of their tools are paid because they are majorly an enterprise level organization and they're not open source. Now they've got a lot of acquisition, but yeah, pipeline is one of the component of Azure DevOps. Other than artifacts, test, pipeline, and a lot of other tools, pipeline is the one which helps us to create the CI/CD for Microsoft products. So if you're using Microsoft ecosystem, Azure or virtual machine or Azure Kubernetes cluster, go ahead and use Azure pipelines. Alright, so Azure pipeline support continuous integration, just like GitHub Action and GitLab, to test, build, and deploy your code. Again, your code could be anything, could be your infrastructure, which is a Terraform code, a Pulumi code, or could be anything. Or your application, Node.js, .NET, Java. High chances if you're using .NET, go ahead and use Azure Pipeline. I've used it for multiple Microsoft ecosystem, works like a charm. So that's the workflow. You've got your pipeline, which is you get your pipeline which is version with your code. So you could use Azure DevOps for your code repositories as well, just like GitLab and GitHub. So you could keep your code into Azure DevOps as well, so you don't have to use a different product for CI and different for CD. So you can keep your code repository in Azure DevOps and run all the CI/CD using pipeline. Every branch you use can modify the pipeline, so you could create your CI/CD based on a branch as well. So you could mention that when I push something on a feature branch, please trigger my CI/CD in Azure DevOps. Technically, if you look at GitHub is also a product of Microsoft, because Microsoft bought it a couple of years back. So a lot of features you'll find similar in GitHub and Azure DevOps. One of the cool features in Azure DevOps is you can click through the GUI and start creating your CI/CD, unlike other tools. So you not only get YAML features, but you also get the UI feature as well, which you could just click through it and start configuring your CI/CD. So you're not technical enough, don't want to use YAML, you can get started with the UI as well. Alright, so in terms of the architecture, this is how it looks like. You edit your code onto your local system. Again, could be any application, could be any infrastructure for any cloud. You push your code into Azure DevOps, or for that matter, any CI/CD tool. Continuous integration, build the task which you have mentioned into your pipeline. Test the task, create the artifact. Now, artifact could be a pip package, could be a Maven repository, could be infrastructure builds, Terraform builds, could be a PowerShell script, could be anything. Create those artifacts, and then does the deployment or delivery, whichever you choose, as a release task, and deploys to the target. Again, these target could be anything, could be a Azure virtual machine, could be an S3, could be an EKS cluster, could be a GKE as well, or a DigitalOcean, could be anything. It doesn't matter. Let me give you an overview, or let me give you how the entire stages, steps, jobs which you have discussed so far into Azure DevOps. So this is how it looks like. So you've got your trigger, and now you trigger basis on when do you want to when do you want to get the builds to trigger, whether it's a push, pull artifact, or create a PR. When do you want to trigger the pipeline? You define it, and then in the pipeline you define all the stages. Each stage would have multiple jobs running on an agent. Now it is agent over here, it was runner in GitLab and GitHub. Underneath each job or stage, you define all the steps. How do you want to build your application? How do you want to deploy it? Define it under the steps. So this is the entire workflow of how your Azure pipeline is going to look like. Let me show you YAML how it looks like. It starts with the trigger, as I mentioned over here. Then you've got the pipeline over here. Define the jobs. You define the pool, or where runner, where the entire pipeline needs to run. Mac OS, Windows, or Linux, and define your jobs. And underneath the jobs, you define the steps. What do you want to do? You want to build your code, you want to migrate a file system, move a file system, you want to do a Maven build, you want to do a Gradle build, you want to do a Gradle test, could be anything. Now that's gonna differ from your project to project. Now that brings me to the important topic, how the fundamentals of Azure pipeline looks like. It starts with the pipeline. So you've got your workflow, you've got your pipeline in GitLab, you've got your pipeline over here as well. It defines the continuous integration delivery. It is again defined in YAML, just like GitLab and GitHub. It can be thought of as a workflow that defines how your test, build, and deployment steps are run. Then you've got your run step, represent one execution of a pipeline. It collects log associated with running the steps. results of running test as well. Then you've got your jobs. A stage can have multiple jobs. Each job runs on an agent. Over here it's called as agent rather than runners, but it's same again. It's the machine wherein your pipeline runs. Then you've got a script. Now script contains a PowerShell, could be a PowerShell command line bash, and you can run these scripts on cross-platform as well, like macOS, Linux, or Windows. Pretty cross-functional. Alright, then you've got a steps. A steps is the smallest building block of a pipeline. For example, a pipeline might consist of a build and test steps. A steps can either be a script or a task. Stage is the logical boundary of the pipeline. It can be used to mark separation of concerns. For example, you want to do the build first, then you want to do the QA, then you want to do the production deployment. Alright, that brings me to the last tool, which is the CircleCI. Now I haven't used this tool a lot, but I've heard from many of my colleagues and many of the organization that this is a great tool when it comes to CI, because this is specifically built for CI, unlike other tools which does the both job of keeping the code, running the CI as well. So this does the CI and CD both. So it's a continuous integration and continuous delivery platform that automates the building, testing, and deployment of your software. It helps development team to automate the process of software testing, deployment, speeding up the delivery of new features and bugs. It integrates with a variety of tools like GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and enables team to build, test, and deploy. Now you can keep your code into GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab. However, you could use the CircleCI. Now logically, if you think there's no logic to use a different tool for CI, because GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab would also give you a CI feature as well. So in my opinion, keep things minimalistic. If you're using one tool, use the same tool for CI/CD as well. But yeah, that doesn't happen in the enterprise level of the organization. There are many political reasons, there are many other reasons as well. But that brings me to the fact, how do we want to maintain the CI/CD configuration in the CircleCI? Alright, that brings me to the another point. How do you want to maintain the entire CI into the CircleCI? Let's get into the overall architectural overview of CircleCI. So as you can see, you've got the repository, could be sitting on GitLab, Bitbucket. I don't think CircleCI gives you the repository features. It has to be sitting into some sort of source code repository. You've got a CircleCI API, so it looks for it gets integrated with the repository. As soon as it sees a new commit, the API triggers the ops. The orchestration mechanism has got a config.yaml file. It consists of a workflow, caching, and context and artifact components. As soon as whatever you have defined in the config.yaml, so over here it is called as config.yaml, but the common pattern is in all of these tools, YAML is the tool which you got to learn if you want to learn how to configure the CI/CD. So whatever you have defined into the workflow, it executes in the execution, which is your again the build agent or runner, whatever you want to call. Could be a macOS, could be Linux, could be a Windows, and then it does the deployment onto the target environment. You've got a notification as well if one of the stages gets failed or the build gets failed. Now let me take you through how the config.yaml in CircleCI looks like. So this is how it looks like. It goes through the build first, define what are the steps, and then in executor is the build agent where this pipeline needs to run. Windows, Linux, some sort of machine, right? It is defined in the executor. Then in the job you define what are the steps, and then you define what are the steps which you have defined obviously over here in the steps section, that you check out the code, you restore the cache, run the Maven build package. Alright, that brings us to the last slide, which is what are the components of CircleCI. So first we get started with CircleCI pipeline. which is similar to workflow or similar to your pipeline into Azure DevOps. Then you've got your orbs in CircleCI. Orbs are the reusable snippet of code that help automate repeated process, accelerate project setup, and make it easy to integrate with third-party tools as well. Then you've got your jobs, which are the building blocks of your configuration. Jobs are collection of steps which run command script as required. Each job must declare an executor that is either machine, a virtual machine, or a Docker or a Windows machine, could be anything. You've got a parallelism feature as well. The more test your project involves, the longer it takes for them, so it caches it. It could run things in parallel as well. Fifth feature you get with a dedicated product like CircleCI. Steps, which is again the collection of executable command. This is common across all the tools, so I'm not going to talk much about it. Then you've got the workflow, which is the orchestration job, defines a list of jobs and their run order. It is possible to run jobs concurrently, sequentially, or a schedule, or with a manual stage as well. Pretty much all. That brings me to the end of the session, and in terms of recap, we spoke about what CI/CD is. Then we spoke about what GitLab is, how it has evolved over the time, what GitHub Action is, then how GitLab is integrated with different products, and then you've got your GitHub CI/CD as well, which is GitHub Action. Then you've got your Azure DevOps pipeline, and then the CircleCI. If you look at what's common between all of these tools, the way you write the code, the CI/CD feature, the CI/CD fundamental, and most important, all of the tools uses YAML to write or configure CI/CD. So YAML is one such tool you got to learn in order to build a robust CI/CD system. I hope this was super informative and you enjoyed watching this video as I enjoyed recording this video as well. For any other topics around CI/CD, drop in a comment and I'll happy to do a hands-on session or record some other such videos as well. I'll see you in some other video. Thank you.